Hello, back again on the Top Recap channel. This time I will tell a movie's entitled Castle Falls. Let's get straight into the storyline. The film begins by showing a man named Mike, who is a legendary MMA fighter. However, because Mike was not young anymore and had suffered a severe shoulder injury, he rarely fought anymore. One day, Mike met his former manager and asked him to bring him back to the battlefield. But his former manager said that he could no longer fight because of his age and a fairly severe shoulder injury. So he recently suffered 3 consecutive defeats in his last fight. However, Mike continues to insist on asking his former manager to help him fight back because right now he really needs money. Because his former manager still refuses to bring him back to the battlefield, Mike tries to convince him by challenging one of the fighters there.
Now, you give me one last shot, right? You owe me. I'll fight your golden boy out there.
You're fucking nuts.
Initially, Mike had mastered the fight. However, Mike starts to get tired, and his opponent takes advantage of this to corner him and finally defeats the once legendary MMA fighter. After experiencing this defeat, Mike begins to accept that he is no longer a great fighter who acts in the high-class battle arena. He is now bankrupt and kicked out of his apartment because he can no longer pay the rent. He then gave away his boxing gloves, which indicated that he had decided to retire as a fighter and tried to move on with his life by looking for another job to make ends meet.
They've been at it a week, but there's a couple days left.
Was it construction?
Not exactly construction, but it's close.
Mike then gets a job as a construction worker involved in the Castle High Hospital eviction project. The scene then switches and shows a middle-aged man named Richard, who lives with his daughter Emily, who is lying sick in her bed. Emily suffers from leukemia, so it requires a lot of medical expenses. Not long after, a woman came to Richard and collected Emily's care fees while she was being treated at home. However, Richard did not have the money to pay the fees.
But I cannot come back here until I get my money.
He then received a call from the hospital telling him that Emily had to undergo chemotherapy again. But before that, they asked him to pay $400,000 for medical expenses because the health insurance he had had run out for his previous medical expenses. Richard seemed very frustrated with his situation right now and wondered where else he would get the money to pay for Emily's treatment. The scene switches to a federal prison, where a black prisoner named Lando is arguing with another prisoner named Damien when he asks about the whereabouts of some money hidden by Lando. They then got into a fierce fight, and a warden seemed silent when Damien and his henchmen ganged up on Lando. The scene then switches back to Mike, who seems to be daydreaming about his fate, which has drastically changed from a legendary MMA fighter to a construction worker with little wages. His employer, realizing that Mike was neglecting his job, reprimanded him and asked him to focus more on work because they had a deadline before Castle High was torn down. On the other hand, it appears that the mayor is making a statement in front of reporters that the Castle High Hospital will be evicted the day after tomorrow, and the land will be diverted for the construction of a new sports building. Lando, who happened to be watching television in his detention cell, seemed surprised to learn that Castle High Hospital was about to be evicted. Lando then asked to meet the chief warden, who was none other than Richard. Without further ado, Lando asked Richard to immediately transfer him to the southern prison block, while offering him some money that he could use to pay for his daughter's treatment. But because Lando mentioned Emily's situation, Richard immediately got angry and hit him. The next morning, Richard secretly went to Lando and asked about the money because he really needed money this time. Lando then revealed that he once robbed Damien of $3 million and that the money was hidden in the Castle High Hospital, which was about to be torn down. Lando said he didn't want the money and wanted to help Richard get money to pay for his daughter's treatment. Lando only asked that Richard move him to the South Block because he was always bullied by Damien and his henchmen if he stayed there. Richard then agreed to the offer. On the other hand, a warden turned out to be on Damien's side and reported to him about Richard, who would move Lando to the South Block so that Damien and his henchmen would no longer disturb him.
That's my money paying him.
Hearing this, Damien immediately assumed that Lando must have asked Richard to take the booty money hidden by the man, considering that Richard needed a lot of money. Damien then called his brother Deacon and asked him to handle the matter. Damien is a drug lord, and now Deacon runs Damien's drug business while he is in prison. While on a break, Mike seemed to be chatting casually with one of the workers named George, who said that in fact he didn't want to work as a construction employee with little income. However, George had no other choice, especially since he was already married with 2 children. Mike then revealed that he used to be an MMA fighter, but now he is bankrupt and forced to work at anything to make a living. George then realized that Mike was really an MMA fighter, and his 2 children turned out to be his fans. Because he has no place to live, Mike is forced to spend the night in a car parked near the Castle High Hospital building. On the other hand, Deacon and his wife Kat seem to be monitoring the hospital building that will be demolished and intend to infiltrate it after all the construction workers leave the place. While moving things, George tells Mike that he dreams of moving to Alaska with his family and then suggests that he go to Alaska. When Mike was cleaning another room alone, he accidentally found a bag containing a very large amount of money, which was none other than the loot that Lando had hidden before he was thrown into prison. Because their working hours had ended, George then asked Mike to get out of there immediately. Mike didn't tell George about the money and just took $10 and hid it back. He planned to retrieve the bag containing the money after everyone had left. Elsewhere, Deacon is preparing his henchmen to infiltrate the Castle High Hospital building, awaiting Richard's arrival, as he has been informed by Lando of where the money is hidden. Deacon and his men would disguise themselves as construction workers to not arouse suspicion. Meanwhile, Richard was already preparing to go to Castle High and collect the money. Before leaving, Richard said goodbye to his daughter and said he had urgent work to finish. Meanwhile, Mike, who was standing in line with George for a beer, told his friend that he had left his jacket at the construction site and had to come back to get it. Mike then enters the Castle High Hospital building, which will soon be torn down, to take the money. Mike was very happy to find out that the money was still where he had hidden it. Instead of going straight away, he took the time to count the money, thinking that no one would know about it. On the other hand, Richard seemed to have entered the Castle High building, but one of Deacon's men noticed his arrival, immediately informing his boss. Not long after, Deacon and his men entered the construction site through the left side of the building. But unexpectedly, a construction worker was assigned to stand guard until the time for the eviction arrived. Without thinking, Kat immediately killed the construction worker to not interfere with their plans. Meanwhile, Richard seemed to be heading to the 6th floor according to the directions previously told by Lando. He saw a pile of explosives that would be used to tear down the building in 4 hours. Deacon and his men were also seen entering the building. After arming themselves, they scattered around the building to look for Richard's whereabouts. On the other hand, Mike, who noticed Richard's presence in the next room, then hurriedly put the money back in his bag and left. As Mike was about to descend the stairs, he saw Deacon's men heading upstairs. Mike was finally back there again. Richard found a note scattered on the floor and then realized that someone had found the money and taken it. At the same time, he heard the sound of metal clanging, which was none other than Mike accidentally kicking an iron bar. However, Richard was not the only one who heard this. Deacon and his men also heard it, and then rushed toward the sound source because they thought it was Richard. Knowing that someone else was also looking for the money, Mike immediately went into hiding and saw Richard, who was also hiding from Deacon and his gang. But then Deacon and his men's attention was distracted by the appearance of a man who had infiltrated the hospital building, who was none other than George, who was looking for Mike's whereabouts because he had not returned. Kat accidentally found a bag of money in George's pocket and thought that George was the one who took the money. Deacon and his gang then tortured George and forced him to reveal the money's whereabouts, even though George knew nothing about the money. Mike, who saw this from his hiding place, could not help George because George never gave the information they wanted to know. Deacon then ordered his men to kill him. Knowing that George had been murdered, Mike accidentally revealed himself so that his whereabouts were known to Deacon and his gang. Deacon ordered his men to arrest Mike. On the other hand, Mike seemed very guilty about George's death and decided to avenge his death. After hiding the money, he dropped several of Deacon's men before Kat, and his gang finally cornered Mike.
Hi there.
But Mike managed to break free from Kat and his henchmen and escape through the garbage can.
Fuck, you trying to blow this place up?
However, Richard was already there and immediately caught Mike. Richard then threatened Mike with a knife and forced him to tell him where he hid the money. But Mike argued that he was just a construction worker and knew absolutely nothing about the money. Seeing Richard slightly off guard, Mike then attacked him so that the two got into a fierce fight before finally being stopped by one of Deacon's henchmen, who threatened the two at gunpoint.
I got him.
Mike and Richard tried to calm him down and managed to catch him off guard, so Mike could immobilize him. However, the rest of Deacon's men began to arrive, so Mike and Richard had no other choice but to flee from there. Deacon then ordered his men to block access in and out of the building and tried to make a deal with Mike to give up the money, and Deacon would keep him alive. But of course, Mike ignored the offer and chose to fight Deacon's men. Mike, who was trapped by Deacon's men in the building, then jumped out the window while hanging from the thick curtains. But as Deacon and his henchmen kept shooting at him from below, he finally tried to get back inside the building, where he was confronted by Kat pointing a gun at him. Luckily, Richard came and hit Kat, pushing her body against the window. Thinking that the one by the window was Mike, Deacon and his men kept shooting at her until they found out it was Kat. Deacon was devastated to see his wife, who died horribly after falling from a height, then vowed not to let Mike and Richard out of the building alive.
They never leave this shithole. We bury them here.
On the other hand, Richard treated Mike's injured arm, then asked him about the money, but Mike still argued that he was just a construction worker and knew nothing about it. Mike and Richard confronted Deacon's men again, but both managed to kill them all. Mike then pointed a gun at Richard, thinking he was one of Deacon's gang in disguise. But Richard immediately denied it and revealed that he was forced to do all this because he no longer had the money to treat his daughter. Mike finally believed Richard's words. He then told Deacon via walkie-talkie to come personally and collect the money upstairs.
So if you want your money,
it's up here with me, so come and fucking get it, arsehole!
After that, Mike took the money he had hidden and shared it with Richard. Richard then invited Mike to get out of the building immediately, but Mike intended to slaughter Deacon and his henchmen to avenge George's death. Given that the Castle High building would be torn down in a few moments, Richard also assured Mike that Deacon and his men would die from the explosion. After thinking about this, he finally gave up and intended to run away with Richard. On the other hand, the mayor and the other construction workers were preparing to tear down the Castle High building in 15 minutes. Deacon and one of his remaining men then chased after Mike and Richard, who tried to escape through the roof of the building, where they engaged in a firefight, causing Mike to be restrained and hide to avoid Deacon's attack. Mike then asked Richard to go first while he would fight Deacon alone.
4 minutes, come on!
you go, just go!
Deacon then ordered his men to go down and guard the access to the exit of the building to prevent Richard from running away with the money. When Mike ran out of ammo, he then challenged Deacon to a close-range fight. Meanwhile, Richard managed to kill the only remaining Deacon henchman and fled by driving their truck. Mike finally managed to beat Deacon, then ran off with the money. Because Castle High would be torn down in a few minutes, Mike was forced to jump into Richard's truck while Deacon, still alive, tried to collect the money that was scattered on the roof. The Castle High Hospital building was finally torn down along with Richard and Mike, who drove away from the collapsed building, while Deacon's fate was unknown and may have been buried in the building that had been destroyed.
What a fucking day.
A few days later, Mike gave George's family some money to help them deal with financial problems after his death. After that, he drove to Alaska following George's advice. Meanwhile, Richard moved Damien into the South Block, which turned out to be one of Lando's requests because he intended to kill Damien there.